It has been way too long since my last Blu-ray and DVD update video where I keep unintentionally putting this off. Where I've gained so many titles to talk about, you are likely going to see an increase in collection updates, which is hopefully good news for those watching. Anyway, this is going to be my May 2023 update. Let's begin with the Blu-ray, starting off with World War Z. This is advertised as the extended action cut of the movie, and it certainly does double down on the action. Very little horror kind of stuff in this, especially for something that was meant to be kind of a generic zombie movie. This is very much an action movie at heart with some light sci-fi elements implemented within. And I loved the story behind this, rather than just focusing on a generic survival story. Within the apocalypse and the downfall of humanity, it does retain some elements of the downfall, but is very much an uplifting film about the main protagonist of Jerry, played by Brad Pitt, leaving his family behind to go on what essentially feels like a suicide mission, where he travels around the world and retraces the steps as to where the outbreak of zombieism has occurred, in the hopes of finding a cure. And I loved the changes in the settings throughout, especially the sequences that took place in Jerusalem, where the characters were smart enough to wall themselves off from the rest of the world, and stupidly started making so much noise that zombies just literally piled on and managed to make it over the wall. And that was a very harrowing scene that really did stick with me and just showed how quickly the zombies were able to wipe out such a large portion of human beings. Overall, a very thrilling, action-packed ride, and definitely a film that the pacing of which was so fast, it just flew by. So this was definitely a movie I would highly recommend, and definitely an action film I will be revisiting in the not-too-distant future. Next up we have Terminator Salvation. This is the director's cut of the movie, and a limited edition release where the Blu-ray set is done in the skull style of the T-600 Terminator robot. And overall, the movie in itself, I went in with very low expectations, and I was very surprised at just how much I enjoyed this film. It felt as though it brought everything full circle. I can see there being some issues with the progression of the story, particularly the direction of the character of John Connor, this time played by Christian Bale, and with Sam Worthington's character of Marcus being kind of a hybrid weapon between humanity and a Terminator. I can see that being a huge problem for a lot of people, especially with how the story progressed, and the ending in particular, where the hatred of that machine was, funnily enough, the machine that saved John Connor's life. A little bit on the nose in my eyes, but otherwise the action was very enjoyable. The visuals in particular, especially the CG work, was fantastic, and the cameo of Arnold Schwarzenegger towards the end was very rewarding in my opinion. And let's take a look at this limited edition Blu-ray set before we delve any further into this update. The skull design looks absolutely incredible, of course, very shiny. And then the disc is stored in the back of the skull there, where we have the disc tray on the inside there, neatly tucked away. And even though this, just as is, will look pretty ugly on the shelf, I do appreciate the box set that it is contained in. And as far as the rest of the franchise for the Terminator movies go, let me know in the comments, should I continue beyond this film? To be honest, this was satisfactory enough for me to kind of just leave the Terminator franchise behind. I was surprised about certain ideas represented within the film, and I feel this is enough without things getting too silly, shall we argue. Next up we have Jason and the Argonauts, the original 1963 film, which if you're planning on grabbing this movie, I definitely recommend this Blu-ray release in particular. It obviously includes the Blu-ray, but it has a DVD disc of the film and some beautifully illustrated art cards based on some of the more pivotal scenes from the movie itself. And speaking of the movie, I honestly found this to be a bit of a slow burn, but it was very enjoyable in terms of the story. I really liked the elements based obviously on Greek mythology, following the main character of Jason, who is tasked to sail around the ocean, overcoming various challenges to acquire the Golden Fleece to claim the throne to the Kingdom of Thessaly. And this was wrongfully taken from him by his uncle, who murders Jason's father, takes the throne for himself, and sends Jason on a very difficult journey. And for the film itself, in terms of the technical standpoints, there is a lot to admire when it comes to certain segments of the film where elements of stop motion were used to create some of the more challenging visual effects, and I honestly loved those scenes in particular. And even though they look a little bit dated now, you can find videos on YouTube comparing those scenes as they were in the film to various elements of restoration and even 60 frames per second and increased frames going even beyond that, looking at how the statues and the various foes featured throughout the movie would move if given various updates to fit with more modernized filmmaking techniques. Some interesting stuff, a film of the time for sure, and if you're interested in sort of mythological kind of stuff, I would definitely recommend checking out this movie. So that is Jason and the Argonauts. Next up we have a foreign film which I imported from Germany. This is Er ist wieder da, which translates to Look Who's Back, and look who's back. Somebody that's probably going to get me demonetized. Yes, this is what I would arguably say a very selective dark comedy where only a select few audience members would likely find this to be extremely funny. This was 100% my twisted sense of humor, and I will be looking into the original source material, the book this is based on, where Adolf Hitler is miraculously removed from 1940s Germany and thrown into the contemporary era into 2014 Berlin, where he is struggling to come to terms with what has happened to him and adjusting to the modern world, which I thought was absolutely hysterical. It very much reminded me of Borat, just a character that is very unusual to say the least, a fish out of water essence of story, and Adolf Hitler is struggling to come to terms with the modern world, where he is instead viewed as a very outright comedian and a satirist, where the modern world don't actually see him as Hitler, but that he is basically making a statement, even though he has his own agenda of making a Fourth Reich, and elements relating to that are absolutely hysterical. This film really did surprise me. The first two acts were absolutely phenomenal, 100% my kind of humor. The last act, however, a little bit disappointing, I'll be honest. Things fell kind of flat compared to the previous gags that were thrown around at the start of the film, but otherwise, I thought this was very enjoyable. If you're interested in sort of dark comedy, and if you're a fan of films, I would arguably say like Borat, then perhaps you would find some enjoyment from this. This is a German movie with English subtitles. I struggled to find a copy online that actually had the subtitles, so I just bit the bullet and bought the Blu-ray, and I'm glad to have this one in my collection. A very unusual but very funny movie. Keeping up the theme of black comedies, next up we have Anomalisa. This was a very unusual stop-motion film which was written by Charlie Kaufman, who has written films such as Being John Malkovich, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, as highlighted there, and it was directed by Kaufman and a man called Duke Johnson. And this stop-motion movie is unlike anything I've seen before. I wouldn't necessarily call it a masterpiece like the reviews are screaming on the front cover, but this was a very unique movie to say the least, where the main character of Michael is a motivational speaker who is traveling to deliver on a topical talk, and we see life through his eyes as being very mundane, very generic, where basically every single character he comes across, whether it's his wife, his child, anybody he comes into contact with, such as the folks at the hotel that he is staying at, they are all voiced by the same person and essentially have the same voice. There is nothing different about anybody, he just views everybody as flat out the same. Until he comes across a lady called Lisa who has a different voice, and hearing this just enchants him, it blows his mind. There is still something unique out there that could really take him by surprise. And despite being a married man, he pursues this Lisa and wants to create a new life with her. And the stop-motion elements to this, the characters, the designs overall, and the overt kind of fourth-wall-breaking humor was absolutely incredible. Very well-written story, albeit not a film that really entertained me as much as I was expecting, but it's still something that I would recommend. And if you're a fan of Charlie Kaufman, he has written some incredible screenplays over the years. I would definitely recommend checking this film out based off of that alone. So that is Anomalisa. Next up we have a couple of animated films, starting off with The Princess and the Frog, Disney's 49th classic title. This film I very much enjoyed, particularly for the musical-inspired elements, but the villain, Dr. Facilier, voiced incredibly by Keith David, I really enjoyed him as a character, and I was really hoping there would be a lot more of him throughout this film. Sadly not, he was very much overshadowed, unfortunately. He didn't really have, in my opinion, enough screen time to become such an iconic Disney villain. But overall, this film was very enjoyable, following similar beats to what you would expect from a typical kind of princess film, and then throwing that completely on its head, where the main character of Tiana is someone that is overworked, who doesn't have time for a social life or a love life, and then she comes across a frog that she must kiss to turn him back into a prince, only for the effects to be reversed, where she is instead turned into a frog and forced to live the life of a frog. Overall, a very fun film, some interesting twists and turns throughout. I wish we had gotten more of Dr. Facilier as a character, but regardless of what we did get, this was a very enjoyable movie and had some very fun visuals featured throughout. Next up, we have a Japanese movie directed by Satoshi Kon. This is Perfect Blue, which was recommended to me by my good friend Arvid, aka Junkmaster Free, and we were discussing this movie, which I've sadly not seen as of yet, called Paprika, and this movie was from the same director and came out prior to that other film, so I decided to grab this one, and honestly, I found this to be a brilliant piece of cinema. A brutal psychological thrill ride where the main character is questioning their self-identity, where the character of Mima is transitioning her career from a pop star to a drama actress, and her obsessive fanbase do not appreciate this sudden change, and so they decide to sabotage her work, where she finds various people included in her work are being murdered, and she begins to suspect herself as the killer, and I feel rewatching this film I will gain a greater appreciation for it, but I really enjoyed it for what it was, and I am looking forward now to checking out Paprika, having now seen this movie. So that is Perfect Blue. A very unexpected and heavy hit of nostalgia from the folks over at Warner Archive. This is the complete series of Duck Dodgers. All 3 seasons of the original show, all 39 episodes, and this has been an absolute blast to revisit. I adore this show. Looney Tunes is something that has always stuck with me over the years, and this in particular is something that implements a lot of what I loved about the old Looney Tunes cartoons, obviously Daffy Duck in particular, but utilizing the elements that were from some of the Chuck Jones cartoons, the heavily integrated sci-fi stories in particular, such as the original 50s Duck Dodgers cartoon. This was essentially based off of that and turned that into a complete series of itself, with the main character of Daffy, now Duck Dodgers, protecting the Earth from imminent Martian infiltration, with Marvin the Martian imminently about to invade the planet at various intervals throughout the series. And this has been a really wonderful re-experience of the show. I don't know why I had it in my mind that this show was so much older. I guess because I was kind of referring it back to the original 50s cartoons, but no, this came out in the early 2000s. It does show, obviously, with the animation itself, especially some of the very impressive 3D animation. And the stories themselves, some very fun stuff throughout, very enjoyable dialogue, some great action in particular, some great comedy-focused stuff, and this is a series that I will definitely be doing a separate video on the channel, so keep an eye out for that coming up very soon. And last up for the Blu-rays, we have Season 6 of Rick and Morty. This is the Steelbook edition, and is overall, as far as the release goes, a great release for the show. As far as the actual season itself goes, meh, not great in all honesty. It seems to repeat a lot of the same mistakes from Season 5, doesn't really improve on the content overall. There are a couple of standout episodes. I'd say it's about 50-50, if not really 60-40, in favour of there being more poor episodes than great episodes. You can check out my review on the channel, which is a recent upload if you want to hear my full thoughts on this season. But overall, I expect better from a show like this, and I'm really hoping that Season 7 will improve and iron out a lot of the ongoing issues that people have had with this show, including myself, but we shall see how the future progresses for this show. Moving on now to the DVDs, next up we have a couple of comedy movies from director John Hughes, that being Uncle Buck and Planes, Trains and Automobiles, which both star the legendary comedian John Candy. I had never seen Uncle Buck before, but Planes, Trains and Automobiles I'd seen on television a couple of times. I just never owned it in the collection, and I was very tempted to grab the recent 4K restoration of this film, which had some very unique bonus features included, which had approximately, I believe, 70 minutes worth of cut footage from the final film. And if you take into account that the final film itself is only about an hour and a half anyway, you're getting something that is near enough double the length, which is incredible. The only downside was the footage wasn't restored in any way. It wasn't even in DVD quality, never mind Blu-ray quality. Apparently it was just some old rips from a VHS copy from what was laying around. at the time of putting the Blu-ray release together, and when it comes down to the film itself, I'm only a casual fan. I don't need to see an extra 70 minutes of footage, especially when it wasn't really overly rated positively anyway, but it would have been neat to have something like that anyhow. But regardless, the film itself is overall a very fun film, a borderline frustrating comedy. Some great characterization, seeing opposites come together with the character of Neil, played by Steve Martin, a very business-oriented man who is hell-bent on trying to get home to see his family over the Thanksgiving holiday. And when things go wrong, oh boy, do they go wrong. And things are made far worse when he's put with one of the most frustrating men on the planet, the overly nice Del, played by John Candy, a very heartwarming character that sadly Neil does not see as being heartwarming at all. A very fun film with some very memorable moments throughout. And Uncle Buck was a recent watch for me, which I really loved what John Candy brought to the character of Buck Russell. A character that doesn't really take shit from anybody, a very level-headed individual as well, who helps look after his brother's family, his nieces and nephew, during a family emergency, and where he struggles with commitment in his own personal life. This experience of looking after his brother's kids really does round him out and even him out, allowing him to grow. Some excellent writing where it resolves a lot of his personal commitment issues, where he's able to improve upon his own personal life. Next up we have Adaptation, which was written by Charlie Kaufman and directed by Spike Jonze. And if you're a fan of the movie Being John Malkovich, you should recognize those names, where this film literally begins on set of Being John Malkovich. It kind of sort of feels like a spiritual sequel, set in the same universe, but obviously doesn't follow the chronological events of said film. Instead, this movie follows Nicolas Cage portraying a fictional version of Kaufman himself, who is a struggling writer who is really struggling to adapt a book into a screenplay known as The Orchid Thief. And a book about flowers is seemingly now impossible to adapt into a screenplay, where he writes himself into his own screenplay, documenting the struggles with what he's being tormented over. All the while, his twin brother, who is also played by Nicolas Cage, Donald Kaufman, is becoming a successful Hollywood writer at the same time, and this really frustrates him. And I love how with these twists and thrilling ideas, it really does blur the lines of reality for us, the viewer. And I felt that Nick Cage really did handle this script phenomenally, especially taking into account that he's basically playing two roles simultaneously. Overall, a very impressive film, very much a movie that I feel will be more beneficial to revisit on multiple occasions. And if you enjoyed the movie Being John Malkovich, definitely check this one out. Next up we have The Fisher King, starring Robin Williams and Jeff Bridges, and this was a very well-directed film from Terry Gilliam, a very emotionally compelling story looking at Jeff Bridges playing radio DJ Jack Lucas, who is very much separated from society. He's a very narcissistic man who gets a lot of thrills from mocking the general public who call up his radio show, and this goes awfully wrong, where he mocks the wrong person, and the person that he upsets does a mass shooting and blames Jack for the reason as to why he has done this. And several years later, feeling responsible for the shooting, he meets one of the victims face to face, Parry, played by Robin Williams, whose wife was killed during this attack, and the amount of guilt that Jack feels. He feels as though he owes a huge debt to Parry and wants to try and help him in as many ways as he possibly can and try and get the man's life back on track, where Parry is a homeless man who is very much stuck in a fantasy world within his own mind, who is pretty much crazy in the short of things. Overall, a very well acted film, so many twists throughout this that I really did enjoy, especially towards the end, where Jack really does learn a lesson and learns to become more human and more feeling as an individual. Next up we have the complete series of the very short-lived Office sitcom Dilbert, which was cancelled way ahead of its time very quickly after only 2 seasons, and this box set contains all 30 episodes of the show. And if you're a fan of Office-based comedy shows such as The Office or Parks and Rec, anything like that, this is very much an animated incarnation of that kind of humour to compare it to something. And overall, I really do like the characters in particular, especially the main characters, Dilbert and Dogbert, and how they are written. and how the animated style of those characters really does heavily deviate from what they are in the original comic strips from Scott Adams, which there was some interesting controversy about those being rebooted not too long ago. For some right-wing political influences, I guess the less said about that, the better. But the animated series of Dilbert really has stood the test of time as one of those odd kind of cult cartoons. So definitely something I would recommend if you're a fan of office-based humor, and this set is definitely one I would recommend for just grabbing the complete series in one very easy purchase, with this being a relatively inexpensive box set. So that is the complete series of Dilbert. Some Doctor Who related content now, starting off with the complete series box set of Torchwood. This TV series I never really got into at all when I was younger, and it's the only Russell T Davies era-based show of Doctor Who that I'd never watched. So I decided to grab this box set, which I got relatively cheap over eBay. It contains Series 1 and 2, Children of Earth and Miracle Day. It's an 18-disc box set. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what this show will be like, with this one having a little bit more of an adult kind of premise surrounding it, and I'm a big fan of John Barrowman as an actor. I think the character that he portrays of Captain Jack Harkness throughout the earlier seasons of Doctor Who is honestly one of the staples of the Russell T Davies era. A very charismatic actor and a very fun character, to say the least. And I'll be sure to do a video on this later down the line. I might do a part 3 to what I currently have at the moment as my look back on the Russell T Davies era, which part 1 is currently out on the channel. Part 2 should be out in the next couple of weeks or so keep an eye out for that. And hopefully, if people do want to see more of that kind of content, I'll do a part 3 looking at this once I've watched it, and maybe the Sarah Jane Adventures as well later down the line. And when it comes to Doctor Who itself, I've done the unthinkable and ventured into the Stephen Moffat era of the show, with Matt Smith helming the role of the 11th Doctor throughout this run of episodes. And I've heavily criticised this segment of the show on the channel previously, and I'll be honest, I'm still not a massive fan. I got these box sets relatively cheap, especially this one, which is marked as the limited edition steelbook release, but is horribly scratched, and the inside is damaged with the swing tray literally now hanging on by a thread, shall we call it, and the art cards, etc., which made this more limited edition, or more exclusive, shall I argue, they are all missing, etc. But I got this relatively cheap, I'm not going to argue. Having the episodes themselves is more than enough. And I did gain a little bit more of an appreciation for certain episodes of this run, but overall the story itself with Stephen Moffat as the showrunner, nothing compares for me personally to the Russell T Davies era, which is my own personal hang-up, constantly comparing the two. I guess they are very different in their own rights, but still, the Davies era will always be my era of Doctor Who. So that's Series 5, which I watched all of. Series 6 I've not started as of yet, but I do recall the episodes featuring The Silence being some of the more memorable ones, which I did catch on television all the years ago when this originally aired. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the bulk of this story will be like, watching it in a chronological order rather than just watching a handful of episodes here and there. So I may do a video on the channel, maybe looking at the Moffat era later down the line. I know that'll be a very negative video, sadly, but anyway, that's my box sets of Series 5 and Series 6 of Doctor Who. A DVD release I was very excited to grab for the collection. This is the complete 25th season of South Park, where the episode count has sadly dropped from the usual 10 that we used to have, now down to just 6 episodes, and yet again, no bonus features on here, which really is frustrating. I always loved the commentary minis and the deleted scenes that they put out on the South Park DVDs. So much great content where you would learn more about the episodes from what Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the show creators, had to say about their work, and sadly that's no longer even applicable, it looks like. And with this season release in particular, and this being obviously the 25th anniversary of South Park, they did do a live musical event which they filmed as well, which I was hoping would appear as a bonus feature at the very least. But no, sadly not, unfortunately, but it is what it is. It's good to have the episodes themselves, which I have filmed a review video looking at this box set, which I'll try and get out there as soon as possible, so keep an eye out on the channel for that coming out very soon. A rebuy for the collection. This is the complete first and second seasons of the Ren and Stimpy show, and this is the Region 1 edition referred to as the uncut version. There is a Region 2 release which I've had previously in the collection, which is basically exactly the same as this release bar one thing to my knowledge, and that is that the US release includes the banned episode Man's Best Friend, which I plan on doing a video covering in an episode of my series Animation Preservation, and I wanted to get a copy of that in my collection to have as well anyway, and with this, to my knowledge, being the only DVD release to have that, I don't even think the Adult Party Cartoon DVD has, which I outright refuse to buy in all honesty. Those words are probably going to come back to bite me at some point in the near future, but yeah, I wanted to have that in the collection, and with that being the so-called banned episode, this seemed to be the only way to have that and house it properly in the physical collection. So look forward to a video covering that later down the line, and it's good to have the complete series in the collection with that extra episode. And finally, to wrap up this update video, we have a box set I have wanted to add to my collection for a very long time, and that is the complete golden collection of the Looney Tunes. All 6 volumes are included, hours and hours of cartoon entertainment, and what I really do admire about this box set is that these cartoons appear in their unedited form. Some may not be viewed as suitable, arguably, for a more contemporary audience, but rather than censoring what is here or book-burning certain cartoons, thankfully there is just a couple of warning messages on there stating that they are products of the time and to be understood as such, and therefore nothing has been altered when it comes to the cartoons that are included. So we have all 6 volumes, each one is 4 discs, each giving you 24 discs in total. And here are the volumes themselves: Volume 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and of course Volume 6. Some phenomenal artwork on these in particular. And there is the outer cardboard set there as well, some excellent artwork of some of the more iconic Looney Tune characters. And so that's going to do it for my Blu-ray and DVD update for May 2023. I hope you did enjoy. If you did, be sure to leave me a like down below. Let me know in the comments if there's any titles that I've shown off in this video that you would like to see an individual review of. And of course, for more content, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, DVD Review Studios.
Are you threatening me?